Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be talking about Stephen King's wild and wacky, fan favorite, epic, apocalyptic, sweeping novel, The Stand. Look at this chunker. All right, stay tuned. All right, Jordan here. Welcome back. So, just some context. The Stand was originally published in 1978, but King went back 12 years later in 1990 and reprinted the book as a complete and uncut edition. So, that's how the book is sold today. Supposedly, King restored 400 pages from parts of the original manuscript that were cut out by his editors at the time, and then he revised the order of the chapters. One interesting thing that he did, too, is that he changed the novel setting 10 years forward, so that instead of being set in 1980, it's set in 1990, and so King had to update the cultural references and all of that stuff. And so that is the one that I decided to read, and that is the one that's easiest to get your hands on. So let's get into a synopsis. What is this book about? For those of you who have been in a fallout shelter for the past 40 years plus, The Stand is a post-apocalyptic, and probably you could also say fantasy story. It's about a mutated strain of the superflu that breaks out of a biological testing facility at the beginning of the book and wipes out fully 99.4% of the population within a few weeks. And so what follows is a story about the people who remain and who are immune to the virus somehow. And the virus turns out to have been a biological weapon engineered by the government called Captain Trips. And so the rest of the story is about how the people go on and try to survive and rebuild society. I'll put some emphasis there on the word try. So the 0.6% of the population who survive, they're scrabbling desperately to make sense of their new reality, to grieve for their loved ones, and rebuild civilization. And so the survivors all begin to have dreams about these two opposing figures, Randall Flagg, otherwise known as the Dark Man, and this woman named Mother Abigail, who is Flagg's, basically his Manichaean opposite, and she is receiving visions from God. And so essentially the survivors end up dividing into two factions. One is led by Flagg from his outpost in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the other one is led by Mother Abigail in Boulder, Colorado. And as these two factions build up, they basically are preparing for this final stand between good and evil, light and darkness, heaven and hell, all of that kind of Manichaean dualism. I can't really tell you much more about the story than that from a plot perspective because I don't want to ruin the book for you. But that is essentially the gist of it. Now let's get into what I liked about this book, because I'd argue there is a lot to like, even though, and I'm going to say this right now, there was a lot about this book that also didn't work for me. So here's what I liked. As always, Stephen King is great at establishing this perfect balance between plot and character, and that's definitely the case in this book. You have a large cast of characters, and several of them I would say are really memorable. And I'll get into these characters a little bit more later. I promise I'll talk about them. But first, I should just mention one of the best things about this book is the central premise. And I think it's really cool as a thought experiment. This question of what would it be like if the world population was decreased by 95% overnight, or better yet, as it comes to be, 99.4%. How would that change your sense of reality of who you are and how you relate to the rest of the world? Right now, for example, there are about 8 billion people in the world, right? And that's very humbling when you really think about it. We're very small in the grand scheme of things. But here we are in this novel, and the world population is reduced to what it essentially was back in biblical times. And that is very appropriate for this story, especially since there is this very epic biblical sort of Book of Revelations Judgment Day feel to this story. But I think King does a good job of also playing this thought experiment out and highlighting some of the consequences of what happens when all of these people disappear and there are only a few people left. Interestingly enough, when the outbreak decimates the bulk of the American population, there's finally enough to go around for everyone, right? Enough nourishment, enough food, enough of pretty much everything that you need. So that's kind of ironic. Basically, you can break into a Mercedes dealership, right, and drive away with a Mercedes. There's plenty of gas for everyone. You can go into a grocery store and just kind of get what you want, right? Do you want a guitar, right? You could just head on down to the local music shop and pick out your favorite acoustic guitar. So that was one cool kind of post-apocalyptic element, just the feeling of emptiness and abundance. At one point, one of the characters, Stu Redman, says that now, quote, no one locks their doors because there's so much abundance and you don't need to steal from anyone. So that element of the book was really interesting. But here's the catch with all of this. Eventually, the stuff is going to run out, right? People get violent. We are social creatures. We need each other. And so the atomization in this story is only going to last so long. We want to be together as people. We long to cohere into political communities. And so ultimately the rebuilding does have to happen. And that's one of the interesting things about this story. I like too that King thinks he thinks about a lot of these sort of interesting factors and complications that most people would overlook if they were writing a pandemic apocalypse novel. Just simple things like the fact that if you were traveling across the country, you might not actually want to take a car to get where you're going because given how suddenly the disease hits and the fact that so many people die in their cars, right? And there are so many dead people and obstacles and kind of stalls in the road. It turns out, strangely enough, that walking or riding bicycles or slowly riding motorcycles is the best way to get around. And so there's this kind of fantasy, epic journey, Tolkien-esque hunting group of companions sort of archetype in this book as well. I really got the feel of that. And then, too, I just wanted to mention this because I thought it was fascinating. There are just these uncomfortable realities that King touches on and that his characters are genuinely worried about. With civilization gone, Glenn Bateman says, all the chrome and gewgaws have been stripped away from the engine of human society. And so there are things that you now have to think about now that the apocalypse has come that you may not want to think about or that may make you uncomfortable. How, for example, is the world going to change for women? There's a fascinating passage in chapter 46 from Franny's perspective, and I'm going to read it to you. Women's lib, Franny had decided, was nothing more nor less than an outgrowth of the technological society. Women were at the mercy of their bodies. They were smaller. They tended to be weaker. A man couldn't get with child, but a woman could. Every 4-year-old knows it. And a pregnant woman is a vulnerable human being. Civilization had provided an umbrella of sanity that both sexes could stand beneath. Liberation, that one word said it all. Before civilization, with its careful and merciful system of protections, women had been slaves. Let us not gild the lily. Slaves was what we were, Fran thought. Then the evil days ended, and the women's credo was just this. Thank you, men, for the railroads. Thank you, men, for inventing the automobile. Thank you, men, for the hospitals, the police, the schools. Now I'd like to vote, please, and have the right to set my own course and make my own destiny. Once I was chattel, but now that is obsolete. My days of slavery must be over. The rednecks could grunt about burning bras. The reactionaries could play little games, but the truth only smiles. Now all that had changed. In a matter of weeks, it had changed, unquote. So I just find that passage so interesting that in a matter of weeks, all the progress that women have experienced has changed and been reset. And so it's just fascinating how fragile progress is and how it's not inevitable like we tend to think it is, but it rests on certain contingent facts and conditions. Sometimes they're technological. And these are conditions that once you remove them, that progress may not have anywhere to stand, right? And you may have to start over. Or is it possible that you don't? Can certain assumptions and beliefs and aspects of progress become so inviolable and firmly ingrained and kind of baked into people's minds that they'll just rebuild society from the starting point of the progress that they had achieved, right? But this discussion is kind of at the heart of the book, and it impacts everyone, not just women. Progress is set back for men too, for everyone. What happens, for example, if something happens like you get appendicitis? Right now, we live in a world where you get appendicitis and it's a quick and simple, fairly routine surgical procedure to take care of, in and out, right? But when you strip our healthcare infrastructure away and then you get appendicitis in this post-apocalyptic world, you die, right? You die oftentimes. So I just kind of enjoyed the thought experiment at the heart of the story, and I enjoyed some of the early chapters that describe how the virus is spread. There's a really cool sequence near the beginning of the book where King basically tracks the virus from one person to another, kind of like contact tracing, right? Just describing what each person did once they got it and how many other people they unknowingly spread it to. And it's really well written. I just have to say it's interesting how King illustrated the spread of the virus in an interesting novelistic way. And then once we've kind of dealt with the trauma of all of that, right? People losing the ones that they love, the chaos and anarchy and instability, and the government falling, and the initial tumult after that, right? What follows, and this is probably the latter 3/4 of the book, is this whole struggle between good and evil, life versus death, light versus darkness, God versus the devil, heaven versus hell. So there's this kind of holy war aspect of the book, and that really makes this an idiosyncratic, I would say, pandemic outbreak novel, right? King is not playing this like Michael Crichton, so you kind of have to know that going in. This isn't going to solely be about the outbreak, how it happens, how we handle it, the science of it. This book is actually going to turn into something more dreadful, more inventive, and more supernatural, obviously, given that this is Stephen King. But I don't want to give too much away about that. Another unrelated thing that I very much liked, actually, this is something I loved, is that this book, in its very own weird Stephen King sort of way, is an ode to all things Americana, I would say. And I'm not talking about Norman Rockwell or Wendell Berry or Alexis de Tocqueville Americana. It's more like this gritty Western, Midwestern, Route 66, Norman Bates Americana, right? Much of the action in this story takes place in Vegas, Nebraska, Colorado, Maine. You've got abandoned casinos and motels and highways and tunnels. This book is filled with these uniquely American questions and conversations and myths. And there's music too. Music is such a prominent part of this story. One of the main characters, Larry Underwood, was actually a newly famous musician when the pandemic struck. And his hit song, of course, is "Baby, Can You Dig Your Man?" And you've got several characters playing guitar. King even starts a few chapters with musical epigraphs from popular American songs, and there's just this very American essence with many of the characters. The story is populated by con men and grifters and charlatans and thieves, which is very American, right? Let's face it. But you also have earnest, moral people who are trying to do the right thing. And I'm telling you, there are elements of this book that just reminded me of American classics like Huck Finn, and I'm thinking of Lloyd and Polk and how they kind of reminded me of the Duke and Dauphin from Huck Finn. And then I was even reminded of Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and I'm mostly thinking of Tom Cullen and Nick. And you just have so much American scenery and uniquely American references in this book. There's even a character called The Kid, and he's got this duck's ass hairdo and a souped-up Ford Deuce Coupe with flame and chrome pipes. And there's a character called the Trash Can Man who just loves exploding things, which is also very American. And so you can just kind of feel the Americana jump off the page while you're reading this book. And so that brings me to our new segment, The Big Idea, where we examine one key theme or central message of the book. So I want to briefly touch on the story's exploration of an idea that I've always, as a philosophy teacher, found very fascinating. And it's this question of, if you had a clean slate, tabula rasa, and you were placed back into a state of nature. This is an Enlightenment concept, by the way. The idea is that we enter into government out of a state of nature. And of course, the argument that John Locke and the US founding fathers advanced is that even in a state of nature, you have these natural rights that precede government, and that government's primary job is to protect. The idea is that we come into this world with inherent natural rights, and it's government's kind of raison d'etre, so to speak, to protect these rights more fully and reliably than you ever could in a state of nature. So my point is that King really plays with this idea, and he brings us precisely there, to a state of nature, back to a place in an anarchic state of freedom. And the question that these characters, Stu and Nick and Franny and Glenn and ostensibly Harold and Mother Abigail, the question they have to answer as they're starting society and government again from scratch is this question: do we want to keep things the same? Do we want to have a constitutional convention and rebuild America along the lines of what it once was? Right, the Declaration of Independence, the original Constitution. Do we want to have the same Bill of Rights? Do we want to have the same separation of powers? Do we want to establish this land once again along the lines of property rights and legal proceduralism? And do we want to follow the same principles of law and order and the value-neutral public square, these kind of American classical liberal values, the freedom of religion that we have for so long enjoyed? Or do we want to create something new? Do we think we could do better than the founders did? And what would that look like? In fact, I'll put the question this way to my viewers. Ask yourselves, if you found yourself in the post-apocalyptic aftermath of the worst cataclysmic pandemic outbreak ever, and you were one of the sole leaders charged with building the United States back up from scratch, how would you proceed? Would there even be states? Would they be united, right? You can choose any kind of government you want, right? Would you prefer monarchy? Make your case, if so, right? Would you prefer an aristocracy of the wise, right? As Plato wanted in his Republic, where you have these philosopher kings that rule the country. Would you make it a theocracy or a timocracy? How about a democracy? Would you start the calendar over at year zero, French Revolutionary style, with a committee on public safety and the guillotine and the cult of reason? Would you choose socialism or communism or anarcho-syndicalism, right? There are plenty of different ways of governing people. Would you reestablish the constitutional order that we have now with 3 co-equal branches, limited representative Republican government with checks and balances, right? If so, would you make any changes to the Declaration of Independence? Would you amend the Bill of Rights? So that was one element of the book that I found really and truly fascinating. Although I actually wish that King had spent more time developing that aspect of it. Just this question of, how should we live now? Is God telling us something about the way we once lived? Should we be trying a different way? Is this pandemic apocalypse, is this a sign? And that sort of thing. Okay, let's now get into what I didn't like about this book. And I know many of you guys here, my subscribers, are big Stephen King fans, constant readers, so I won't belabor this. I'll just mention a few things, and I'll get into my rating of the book as a whole after that. So this is something that I've now experienced in all 3 of the Stephen King novels I've read, and it's one of my least favorite aspects of his fiction writing. Stephen King, in my opinion, doesn't respect his characters, or at least most of them. He writes as if he's superior to his characters, as if they're all kind of stupid, dumber than him. I've said this before, and I know I said something similar in my review of It, that Stephen King doesn't necessarily write down to his readers, so that's not my criticism. He writes down to his characters. In other words, he writes his characters down below him and then giggles about it with his readers. It's not all of them. In this book, for example, Glenn Bateman is certainly an exception to this. Nick Andros, probably, maybe Stu Redman. But I would argue that at the end of the day, it's most of them that he does it to. And keep in mind, this is not me saying he's bad at characterization. That's not it at all. It's just that I don't get the sense from King's writing that he respects many of his characters. I'll put it this way. I get the sense that King doesn't so much write from a place of empathy as a place of projection. Instead of realizing that people around him are fully actualized, thoughtful, complex, messy, nuanced human beings with rich interior lives, I feel as though sometimes King sees people as abstractions or caricatures and then tries to imagine what it would be like to embody that caricature. In other words, and this definitely could be a projection on my part, when I read his characters, and again, feel free to disagree with me here on this, but it always feels like King is subtly making fun of them. And that leads to another thing as well that I want to mention. So many of Stephen King's characters, especially in this book, have King's attitude, his kind of crude 1960s teenager sense of humor. All of the characters find fart jokes and sexual jokes to be hilarious, and they all kind of share his goofiness and his, I guess, unique inner qualia, right? And I promise I'm not being a prude here. That is not what I'm saying. I just find it to be highly unrealistic that every character has the same goofy ass sense of humor as Stephen King. And again, Stephen King's his sense of humor is like, I don't know, an intellectually advanced ninth grader. Okay. Here's another point. I don't know how else to say this, guys, but this is a bloated novel. This novel is too long. It probably would have been better at something like 900 pages. I'm not one of those people who's like, cut it in half and it would have been perfect. No, cut it down to 900 pages. This thing is a brick. There's just too much fat on this story, guys. I like a sweeping novel, an epic novel as much as the next person, but this might actually be too sweeping, right? Or if it is going to be this sweeping, maybe it should have been written differently. I guess a greater focus on the actual pandemic, on the politics, on the fallout, on the geopolitical situation, the behind-the-scenes conspiracy that's going on, the implications of all of that. This story for a pandemic apocalypse novel, for my taste, is actually too in the characters' heads. And I know that when it comes down to it, that's kind of not the point of this book. Stephen King is not Michael Crichton, so he's not trying to explore the same things that someone like Michael Crichton would want to explore. There's just a lot of word vomit here, and it feels like when Stephen King wrote and then republished this book, it feels like he was at the point in his career where he just felt like he could write whatever he wanted to write to his heart's content, and nobody could really say anything about it, because eventually as a writer you become so powerful that your editors can't even really say anything. It reminds me of David Foster Wallace's quote about John Updike when he said, "Has the son of a bitch ever had one unpublished thought?" And I do sometimes wonder that about Stephen King. Has the son of a bitch ever had a single unpublished thought, right? He just spills it out on the page. All right, so let's get into my rating of the book. So let's start with the story. I found the story overall to be a bit meandering, to be honest. It started about a third of the way through the book, and it just felt so directionless at times. There's that oft-repeated distinction that George R. R. Martin makes between so-called architects and gardeners. And King is definitely a gardener, from what I can tell. And yet, I don't actually think that it's really a good thing for him, because I feel like he is often just making it up as he goes along, and that there's really sometimes not enough of a plan, or at the very least, a kind of underlying teleology to the story. And I think that's one of the things I've found with every novel of his I've read. He starts with a great premise, and the characters all do have some underlying looming destiny. They're headed towards something, and that keeps people reading. But I get a sense that King only has a vague idea of what that something is that they're headed towards, and he sure as hell doesn't know how he's going to get there, and that's apparent when you read him. And some of the chapters, man, are just so long. Like having to spend 24,000 words, right, with Trash Can Man and the kid is just, some of these chapters are like novellas. And I don't know if there's enough in there to justify that. And I'll mention, too, that I don't like how Stephen King's stories are all action at the end. He kind of like writes himself into a corner and then has to blow a bunch of things up to get out of the trouble get out of that corner he's written himself into. He'll write these huge books, not knowing how to bring them to a close. And then at the end, he'll just make everything blow up, and there's nukes and all sorts of unbelievable stuff. And everything's kind of this Western showdown, and everything explodes and all hell breaks loose. I found that to be the case with Under the Dome. I found that to be the case with It, and it was certainly the case with this book. Although I will say the epilogue at the end, that very last chapter, was actually pretty cool. I like the way that it ended on that very last point. So overall, with the story, is going to be a 6 out of 10, guys. Sorry if that's a little harsh for your taste. Characters. So as I said, there's good and bad with the characters. I already mentioned the bad. My favorite characters are probably Nick Andros, Larry He Ain't No Nice Guy Underwood. I liked Stu Redman a lot, Glenn Bateman, and I really liked Franny Goldsmith as well. And I really liked Franny's father, though we don't get to spend much time with him, unfortunately. And those are probably the best characters. Those are the characters that I liked and would spend time with if I could. And then there were some characters, too, that were well written and interesting and very original that I don't think I'd want to hang out with, but they were interesting creative inventions. The Kid is a good example of this. The Kid is probably legitimately one of the craziest, wildest, and most inventive characters I think I've ever encountered in a book. Just really a fascinating creation on King's part. I also thought Harold Lauder was very compelling too. Again, not because I like him, but because he's just this fascinating writer, loner, strange kind of incel character. And I thought he made a good antagonist in a lot of ways. And I don't doubt that Stephen King wrote some of his self into that character as well, given that he's a writer. Randall Flagg is pretty cool too, but I don't want to say too much about him because I don't want to ruin the interesting parts of the story. But I thought he was a very original creation as well. So, characters are going to get an 8 out of 10. Stephen King did a very good job. I do have some problems with the characterization, but overall an 8 out of 10, which is a very generous score, I think. Let's talk about the prose. The prose is quite good. King has that writer's gift for probing into the characters psychologically. He has a unique ability, the way many good writers do, to tell the story through the characters. It's as if he is writing in the third person and you feel like he is actually writing in the first person. I was recently talking with Philip Chase about this, that really good writers have this ability to kind of bend the narration so that it reflects the unique voice of each character. Philip actually told me that A.P. Canavan told him that this is called internal focalization. And I'd never heard that term before. King doesn't tell you who characters are or what you should think about them. He shows you who they are by giving you the chance to look at the world through their eyes, from their perspective. And King is also very good at metaphor. So I'm going to give King's prose an 8 out of 10. An 8 out of 10. Madison thought my 8.5 was too high, and ultimately I came to agree with Madison, so I did in fact decide to change it. 8.5 out of 10 for originality. This is a very original world. King is doing post-apocalypse in a way that I don't think anyone's ever done it before, and so it is very original. It's also archetypal in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of kind of dualism and all of that stuff, so not not unbelievably original, not that it has to be. I'm giving it an 8.5 out of 10. World building, the world building was an 8 out of 10. The world building was very good, but also it kind of at the same time felt like it was too zoomed in and I was missing the larger picture. So I'm going to give this world building an 8 again. And so that is a 7.7 overall. 7.7 out of 10. Not bad, but nothing I think I'll ever feel compelled to read again. I'm glad I read it, guys. I'm glad I read The Stand, but I'm also kind of glad at the same time that it's over. Okay, folks, so that's it for today. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Catch up with me on Goodreads, Patreon, Facebook. Ta-ta for now, and happy reading.